Hi, I'm Paul Roby, lead pastor here at South Mountain Community Church, and I just want to say thank you for tuning in to one of our messages today. I hope that you'll find these messages to be both hopeful and helpful. And we also hope that you will just simply use these messages to supplement your own spiritual growth. These are not meant to be a replacement for your own local church. Having said that, I just want to say, if you would like to contribute to the ministry of SMCC and help us provide more resources for more people, we would really appreciate that. Just click the Give button at the bottom of the page.
Do you guys know how long it took Pastor Rick to make that putt? It took all day long. Hey, I'm Eric. As you just saw, I'm one of the teaching pastors. I've been the campus pastor in Lehigh for about the last 4 years, and I'm very excited to be here with you for part 3 of a series that we're calling Neighbors. Now, have you ever been out and about, right? You ever been out and about, and maybe you're at the grocery store, maybe you're at a restaurant, maybe you're parked at a red light, and or this one might be the worst. You're at church, and you look to the left and you look to the right, and then you see somebody that you don't really want to see. Have you had that moment before, right? Maybe you haven't seen them in years and you don't want to go talk to them. Maybe it's been months, maybe it's been years, but this is the thing. They haven't seen you yet. You know this moment? Aren't those some of the most terrifying moments, right? Maybe you dated in high school. Maybe you dated way back in college. And now the last thing you want to do is walk up to them and say something like this: "It is so great to see you," you know? I've had those moments before. I've been inside of those moments. And in those moments, I don't know if you do what I do, but I typically look the other way. Do you look the other way? That's what I do. And maybe even though you don't have kids with you, you're like heading down the toy aisle. You know, you're trying to duck low, stay out of the way. Or maybe you do have kids with you and you like turn it into like combat zone commands. Like, kids, get down, you know, get down, go, shh, there they are, you know. Has this ever happened with one of the pastors around here? You know, you're out and about, you see Pastor Rick, Pastor Paul, Pastor Mike, and you're like, oh no, what am I wearing? Oh no, who am I with? Oh no, what am I drinking? You know, and you see them. These moments are awkward, right? Have these moments ever happened in your neighborhood? Because these moments happen to me in my neighborhood all the time. In fact, we live out in Eagle Mountain. I have a picture of my family, I think, if we have it working here. Yes, here we go. This is my wife, Carissa. We've been married 10 years. This is Nora, she's 7, and Jack. And oftentimes they're up the road playing at a house and it's time to come home. And I look at my wife, I'm like, you should get him this time. She's like, you go get him this time. I'm like, I don't want to talk to the neighbors. She's like, I don't want to talk to the neighbors either. Have you had these moments? I've had these moments, you know, and it's like we're drawing straws to have to see who goes to get the kids. And I don't know why we do this, you know? Connecting can be awkward. Connecting can be weird. Connecting, if you're an introvert, is downright exhausting. I don't know why we do this, but all of this, it brings me to a question. And this question has been rattling around in my mind since we crafted this series a few months back. And this question might be more for me than it is for you, but I thought I would ask you this question anyways. And the question is this right here: which is more difficult, serving your church or serving your neighborhood? Which is more difficult? And I would guess in a room of this size, we're probably split down the middle, because some of you have done the church thing before, and you've sacrificed and you've served and you've shown up early for years, and you did the church thing. And now let's just be honest, it's kind of shocking that you're back in church because you made a vow, you know, not out loud, but maybe to yourself, to not be a church person ever again, and yet here you are. And I'm so glad that you're here today, because here's what I've discovered about people with a story like your story, if I'm describing your story. Although serving church might feel miserable, serving your neighborhood is just delightful. You know, you're mowing yards, you're helping people move in, you're throwing block parties, because for you, it is far easier to serve your neighborhood than it is to serve a church. But there's another group of you in the room, and I'll put myself into this category. And for us, it is far easier to serve church than it is to serve in a neighborhood. And once again, I don't really know why this is, but it could have something to do with my skill set, could have something to do with my personality, or it could have something to do with the fact that deep down inside of me, there is lurking a Pharisee. And 2,000 years ago, a Pharisee was a person who loved to serve religion at the expense of a person. They loved to serve church at the expense of a neighborhood. They loved to check boxes. They loved to check to jump through hoops. This is what they did. And unlike SMCC, where we honor the process that God changes people from the inside out, Pharisees valued change on the outside, regardless of what was going on the inside. And 2,000 years ago, this type of individual, a Pharisee, an expert in religious law, the religious law of the day, shows up to have a conversation with Jesus. And he's convinced he can trap Jesus with a question. And this is what happens next. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. He replied, "How do you read it?" And the story goes on. Well, he answered, "Love the Lord your God." He quotes back from the Old Testament. He knows his Old Testament. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Yeah, you've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." And if you've ever wondered what the Good Samaritan story is all about, it's actually about this. He wanted to justify himself. We'll talk about that in a bit. So he asked Jesus, and Jesus, well, come on, who is my neighbor? And today we continue this series, Neighbors. We're in part 3. And if you haven't been with us in this series, this has been a how-to series. It's how to love the people who live near you when the people who live near you don't live like you. And I would guess that you have some neighbors that don't live like you. And the big idea in this series, we call it a thesis. The idea that we've been taking a next step towards together is this: you can't choose the neighbors that you have. Don't you wish you could, right? You can't choose the neighbors you have, but you can absolutely choose the type of neighbor that you will be. And my hope today is to help you answer the question that this man asked, a question about who. But as we're gonna see, Jesus takes that question and he builds on it, and he makes the story far more about you than who. It is not a story, it is not a fictional story. Jesus told this story to make a point. It is not a story just about who. It is a story about you. And Jesus is gonna take this question, he's gonna turn it around, and it's gonna hit all of us in a way that we maybe didn't see coming. But the question that Jesus gives us, by the end of the day, we're gonna see this, is the type of question that can free us from the pressure of being a better neighbor, and it can free our neighbor from being just our project. Now, parents in the room, parents, you go through the same thing that I go through. Parents, has your kid ever come up to you and asked a question, and you know the moment that they ask it that there's a question behind the question? You know what I'm talking about? Like for me growing up, I did this all the time. "Mom, when will you be home?" was code for "Mom, how late can my friends stay over without me getting in trouble for having friends over?" Okay, it was code. When this man asked Jesus this question, there's a question behind it. And Jesus knows all about that. There's a question behind the question. And the question isn't just about who is my neighbor. The question is about self-justification. How can I justify my existence for living? And every person that's come before this man and every person that's come after this man, including you and I, everyone in the room, everybody watching online, we've come to the same question ourselves. What does it take to justify me? How do I justify my own existence? And so for the man, the question isn't just about who. For the man, the question behind the question was this: what's the minimum amount of neighboring that I have to do to feel good about me? What is the minimum amount of neighboring that I have to do to be justified, to feel good, to have the moral high ground? And then Jesus, he takes that question and he takes the idea of neighboring and he changes it forever. Because here's what Jesus says next. He uses this setting to tell an incredible story. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes," which were, by the way, very valuable in the first century. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. I should say the other side. Now, like all good stories, like all good movies, if you're gonna understand the meaning, you have to know something about characters and you have to know something about context. So let's start with context. I wanna talk to you about this right here. The road to Jericho. Jericho was to the northeast of Jerusalem, but a traveler would actually go down from Jerusalem to get to Jericho, because along this 18-mile stretch of road, a traveler would descend from about 2,500 feet above sea level in Jerusalem to about 800 feet below sea level in Jericho. And of course, this sudden shift in elevation brought incredible changes to the environmental conditions. And so this was a rugged journey. This was a difficult trek for the pilgrims and the merchants and the soldiers who made this journey. And it was dangerous because the surrounding environment provided the perfect place for bandits to hide, for bandits to run off to and make their escape. And so archaeologists tell us that there were Roman outposts along the way to provide safety to the ever-present threat of bandits. And not only that, the historian Josephus tells us that there was one stretch of road so dangerous, it was called the Pass of Blood, which is what I also call I-15 between Lehigh and the point of the mountain. So Jesus uses this context, he uses this moment to leverage this point along the road to make his case. And the first person to come along, the man left for dead on the side of the road, is the priest. And the priest was well respected. He was popular. He was an authority. I mean, as a priest, he was a gatekeeper for Jewish community and Jewish life. And he's coming from Jerusalem, which likely means he was just visiting the temple and doing the priestly stuff he would do at the temple. And so you would think that now he's close to God, and you would think that now he's all spiritual, and you would think he's all ready to love thy neighbor. And he gets to the man, and you would think he's ready to help, right? Wrong. He passes by on the other side. But, let's give him a little grace. Jesus doesn't rail at this guy. I mean, to stop would probably be fatal as well. If this man is still alive, bleeding on the side of the road, the bandits are probably close by. So to stop could possibly be fatal. Maybe he would be next. To stop would also violate some of his religious purity. I mean, to deal with blood, to deal with somebody that might soon become a corpse would violate all of his religious purity, the religious tradition, everything he had going. And so maybe it just wasn't worth the risk. And so for him, it was far easier to serve his church than it was to serve his neighbor. And here comes another person onto the scene. So the priest comes by, here comes a Levite. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So just for a moment, let's talk about the Levite. We don't know why the Levite didn't stop. Jesus, once again, doesn't really tell us why, but I thought I would get real with you guys for a moment. Can I share with you why I often don't stop when I pass by? And I don't think I'm alone in this. Maybe this is why you don't stop. I wonder if the Levite was thinking what we often think, which is, I'm sure someone else will take care of this need. I have places to be, I have people to see. Someone else will handle this. Someone else will step in, and someone else will help. But can I give you just a little piece of insight? If you're taking notes, you could write this down. Check this out. Thinking that someone else will do it only makes it more likely that no one else will do it. Isn't that fascinating? In fact, this happened to me this week. I was driving home and my neighbor had his garage door open. He was building these heavy shelves, putting them up in the garage. He had his reggae music playing because these are the neighbors that live near me but not like me, okay? And so his reggae music is blasting. And guess who looked the other way? Yeah, Mr. Pastor guy. But guys, I'm sure someone else stopped to help, right? Probably not. Because if I don't stop, it makes it more likely that no one else will stop. Isn't this fascinating? See, if you say no to a need that you see, the group of people that could possibly say yes just got smaller by one person. And now it is statistically less likely that someone will stop and help if you don't. When you see a need in your neighborhood, or you hear of a need in your church, you hear about a need in your city, if you don't say yes, it only makes it more likely that no one else will say yes. And so the priest passes by, doesn't stop. The Levite passes by and doesn't stop. And here comes the final passerby. Let's keep reading. A Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Hey, look after him, he said. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. So the last person that I want us to get familiar with in this story is the Samaritan. And when Jesus brought the Samaritan into the story, every Jewish listener would have been shocked, because to the Jewish listener, a Samaritan was the villain. The Samaritan was the villain. And if you're wondering why, go back and listen to part 1 of this series, because we talked about it. When the Samaritan is the hero, it was shocking to every listener. If Jesus was here today and he was describing this type of story to you, he would use the political leader that you can't stand, the leader that you despise, to be the hero of the story. If Jesus was telling the story today, he might use the religious person, the group from the religious people that you just can't stand, to be the hero in the story. He would use the military power that you despise and that you can't stand to be the hero in this story for you. Do you know why he would have done that? Because when the villain is a hero in the story, you no longer can justify yourself. When the villain who is immoral to you becomes the hero in a story of morality, the moral high ground that you had is pulled out from under you. Jesus uses the Samaritan to help this man understand that there is no way through morality to justify your own existence. And so this Samaritan, he takes care of the man's physical needs, financial needs, medical needs, transportation needs. He stays until the next day, which means he stayed overnight to keep this man alive. He is the hero in the story. And to the Jewish listener, they were only the villain in every story up until this point. And I want to point out something here about the Samaritan and the way he approached this man. He did not approach the man as a project. And if you're still taking notes, you could write this down right here. A project approach looks at a neighbor and asks, how can you buy my MLM stuff? How can you serve me? Have you ever felt like a project? You ever felt like someone's project? You know what this is like. I've been there. The smiles are big, the cookies are warm, right? The gifts abound, the love bomb detonates, and then it all goes away the moment they realize you're not buying what they're selling, Man, I've been there. Guys, this is the horrible effect that religion can have on people. Religion can take people who are neighbors, and turn them into clients. And now I'm using you to get something from you. You no longer are a person I love, a neighbor I serve. You are a person that I can get something from. You are now my client. And I am using you to get something from you to feel good about my moral standing, or I'm using you to get something from my God so my God knows how good and moral I am. Religion turns people into clients. It's a project approach. But the Samaritan has a different approach. It's a loving approach. And a loving approach looks at a neighbor and asks, how can I serve you? And this is the approach the Samaritan had. And this is the approach that we have for this entire series. This series is not about turning anybody into a project. This series is all about helping us understand what love looks like. And so Jesus gets to the end of the story, and he turns back to the man who tried to trap him with a question and has a new question for the man. A question that's flipped the original question around, a question that's now built on love. It's a question that's not a trick question. It's not a difficult question. It's not even a gotcha question, but it is a demanding question. And so Jesus turns back to the man and by implication turns to us and asks this question. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell? The man who fell into the hands of robbers. And with this question alone, Jesus redefined neighboring. With this question alone, Jesus changed what neighboring would look like for nearly every person, in every generation, every culture since. And for Jesus, neighboring is so significant. If you want to know who your neighbor is, I'll answer who for you. The who is this: anyone with a need needs a neighbor. Anyone with a need, man, they need a neighbor. And this story is so influential. This story has become an idiom. I mean, this story has made its way into laws of entire countries. This story alone. I have a question for you. Any Seinfeld fans in the room? Anybody love a little Seinfeld? Yeah, I love some. The rest of you are just missing out, okay? Like 3 people in the front row know about Seinfeld. Okay. Seinfeld is fantastic, you guys. And in the final season, there's this one episode where Jerry and George, Kramer and Elaine, they're on trial for breaking the Good Samaritan law. Jesus told a story 2,000 years ago, and it has found its way into pop culture today because this is the lasting influence that Jesus has had on the world. This story has shaped millions. And so if you're the type of person who thinks we should serve people who are hurting, we should help people who are impoverished, and we should do something for the people who can't do something for themselves, if you think that way, you are being influenced by the author of the Good Samaritan story. Maybe you've never thought of it this way before, but you are being influenced by Jesus. And if that's the case, it might be true that you are far closer to Jesus than you ever realized. This is the type of impact Jesus has had on the world. And so to Jesus, neighbor is not just a noun that describes the people that live on your block. To Jesus, neighbor is a verb. In fact, it's this right here. Neighbor, it's the act of intentionally befriending and caring for a person by meeting the unique needs that they have. Neighboring means to see a need and meet it. It means to know the price and pay it. It means to not talk oneself out of it. And could you imagine if we got this right? I mean, neighboring is far more about opportunity than just proximity. Guys, could you imagine if we got this right? If we got this right in Draper, Utah, and South Jordan, down south in Utah County, Lehigh, and Saratoga Springs. Could you imagine if we got this right? Because there are people who have needs, and there are people who need a neighbor like you. And in Draper, Utah, physical needs, financial needs, man, those aren't the real needs. Emotional needs, relational needs, spiritual needs, those are the needs that your neighbors have. And you can be a neighbor that meets those neighbors' needs. And so the question, who's my neighbor? That's one question. But as Jesus got to the end of the story, he made it far more personal for everybody listening and everybody in the room. The question was no longer just about who. The question is now about you. It's about me as well. And the question that we should be wrestling to the ground, the question that we should be thinking about this week is this question right here. Am I a neighbor? Am I a neighbor? And not just do I have people that live near me, because you probably have some people that live near you. The question is far bigger than that. As Jesus defines neighbor, are you one? And this causes us to evaluate what's going on in our hearts. This causes us to evaluate our biases. This causes us to evaluate our prejudices. This causes us to think deeply about us. This causes us to maybe step outside of our comfort zone. So, as Jesus defines neighbor, are you one? Now, when I say that, some things are probably running through your mind, running through your heart. Because when I say that, they're the same things running through my mind and my heart. And every time I've heard somebody preach on this, and as I was preparing to preach on this, and as I asked you the question, are you a neighbor? As I've asked myself the question, Eric, are you a neighbor? There's a no inside of me. And maybe as I asked the question, if you were honest with yourself, there was a no inside of you. Can I share with you some incredibly good news about that no? If you sense a no inside of you to that question, Jesus' point in telling the story is beginning to take its effect in you. Because this story is not just about try harder to love thy neighbor better. This story is helping us see that we cannot stand on moral high ground because we are such good neighbors. This story is helping us move out from the guilt and lets humility move in. That you know what, Jesus, I can't neighbor like this. Jesus, I can't neighbor like you've described this Good Samaritan. I can't neighbor like him. And Jesus would say, yeah, I know. The reason Jesus told this story is to not help us be nicer. It's to help us never be self-justifiers. Because the pressure of self-justification is a pressure we cannot live with. The pressure of loving thy neighbor is a pressure I don't want to live with. And Jesus tells the story to help us understand love, but he tells the story to help us understand that if we try to justify ourselves, we'll never be able to. But there is someone else who can justify us. The reason he told this story is to not get us to be nicer or to guilt us into moral living. It is to free us from the guilt of moral living, to help us see we could never be self-justifiers. And this story is so rich. This story is so complex. We're gonna pick it up here next week and talk more about the toxic nature of self-justification. But I wanna leave you with a quick image, a quick picture to help you understand everything we've talked about today. And the picture is this. This is a stop sign. If you're from California, it's a slow down sign, but either way, it works. I wanna help you understand this in light of this story. See, this story runs on two rails and the stop sign is an illustration for both. I want to encourage you this week to slow down. It's what the priest could not do. It's what the Levite could not do, but it's what the Samaritan did. To slow down in order to be selfless. And throughout this series, we've given you some homework, and I want to give you a homework for this week. This week, I would encourage you to pray one simple prayer each day this week. It is very simple. The prayer is this: God, would you help me slow down today? Maybe as you see a stop sign on your way to work, as you see a stop sign as you roll out of here, this stop sign will remind you of this story. God, would you help me slow down today to see people who are down today? And that is the type of prayer that will help you do what the Samaritan did. But I wanna also encourage you to slow down in a different way. Slow down to be selfless, but would you consider slowing down to evaluate yourself, to see if there's something inside of you that makes you a little bit like the man in the story. Something inside of you that thinks you can justify your existence with your good moral living. Irreligion has that same pressure. Or if you can justify yourself with your good moral living, religion has that same pressure. And if there is, would you slow down and stop? Would you slow down to evaluate yourself? See, listen, you can't be the neighbor Jesus wants you to be if you are trying to justify yourself by being a great neighbor. It doesn't work that way. And in fact, you can't be a neighbor for Jesus until you've been neighbored by Jesus. And as long as this story is just a great principle about how to love people, this story will be too full of pressure for you. Because principles can't serve you, and principles can't love you, and principles don't listen to you when you pray. Principles can't justify you, but a person can. And Jesus told this story not to say, here's some principles to follow, but to say, I'm the person who can justify you. The heart of this story, please never forget this. Every time you hear about a good Samaritan, every time you hear about a good Samaritan law, every time you hear the idiom, would you remember this? That is not a story to guilt me into being nicer. That is a story that is freeing me from being a self-justifier. And we're gonna sing one more song this morning. It's one of my favorite songs. I love this song. And this is a chance for us as we sing to slow down, to evaluate ourselves. And it's my hope that the point of this story that we've learned about today and the point of the song that we're gonna sing about today, it is my hope that it frees us from the pressure of being better neighbors, and at the same time frees us from the pressure of being self-justifiers. Would you guys pray with me? God, we thank you for this incredible story. Jesus, we thank you that you're the master storyteller, and the way you weave people in and out of this story and the way you put a hero into the story humbles us. It doesn't guilt us, and it actually frees us. And as we sing this next song, may we slow down, may we stop to evaluate what's going on in us so that we can be free from the pressure of we should be better neighbors. And really, we would find joy in knowing that we can only find justification in you alone. It's in your name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.